Lindsay, it's lovely to actually meet you, and hopefully the next time we meet will be in person together. This conversation effectively is really being inspired by two of your most recent reports. So Survival of the Fittest and Competing in the Age of Disruption. And, they've been really inspirational to so many people at the foundation. So we just thought it would be a good opportunity for us to connect and talk about that and talk about what's happening in circular economy and what's happening in the world around us. The way we see it is, while there's no doubt that circular economy is on the agenda of global decision makers, and there's some progress and pockets in innovation for certain, we're not really seeing scale yet. And we feel that's what we need to focus on. I don't think incremental change is really going to cut it. And so if we need to change the system, we need a new approach. And your report calls out the need to move beyond business working on transforming themselves and rather working together and transforming whole markets. And I'd love to maybe quote back at you from the report, if I may. So at this historic moment of geopolitical change and economic transformation, the question for businesses is whether they will step up to shape the future or be shaped by it. Moments of political and economic turmoil create opportunities for change. And so with that as the backdrop, I really wanted to talk to you about what's the reality of how we drive this market transformation, and, what is the role of NGOs like ours in this change as you see it? So maybe just to kick off, maybe you could talk a bit about what you mean by market transformation and how it's different from how we've seen incremental progress so far.
Yes, absolutely. And great to hear that the papers are helpful. That's really encouraging. Thank you. I suppose just backing up, it's starting by recognising, as we all know, that the challenges, in particular challenges around whether it's environmental, climate, some of the social challenges, are a result of current models, business models, current models of economic activity. So we know that that's the root cause of the challenges. And if we're just looking at the environment, we know at the moment it's just more profitable to, for shorthand, trash the planet than protect it. And businesses will do what markets incentivize them to do. So we stepped back and said, look, it's really unrealistic to expect businesses to do A when they're being incentivized to do B. So let's just call that and acknowledge that's the challenge we're grappling with. Businesses and economies have delivered huge progress for humanity, but then we haven't incentivized businesses, design markets so that actually they are delivering for the long term for societies, so that let's get to the crux of the problem and acknowledge it. And we know that most big businesses know they need to transition. We have that scaling challenge that you highlighted, and it's really hard to compete against incumbent businesses in today's markets. So our work was saying, let's acknowledge that this is a market-wide challenge, and that if we rely only on what businesses can do within today's markets, even the cumulative impact of all of that good intent in today's markets will leave us facing cascading risks. And so what we're working to do is to build business recognition that it's in their own interests to create commercially viable pathways, which means shifting market incentives and structures. And it's possible that the progress we've seen in renewables and the fact that they're now the cheapest forms of energy, and that, as people say, at escape velocity, that's catalyzed by market interventions, by regulation, by policies combined with innovation, and look what we can achieve. So it's saying, let's apply that principle. We know it works. Let's be really strategic about how we can look at really effective regulation, market interventions that will enable the shifting and harnessing of the power of business and the private sector to drive what's needed. But it's also recognising policy is not the only driver of market change, disruptive innovation. And we know that a lot of European businesses are at risk of being displaced because of the really impressive innovation that we're seeing from China and others in Asia. So competitive displacement is also a very real risk and a market factor.
I love the way you're positioning all of that, and I love the way you're signposting, here's examples of what's possible, because I think I wonder what you think. I think we're also quite overwhelmed at the moment by, let's call it sustainability. Like there's so many different definitions of it, and it's almost reached saturation point. What should we focus on? That everyone's kind of got distracted and moved away from the overall goal. So in this repositioning, what role can NGOs like ours play in moving and shifting goalposts around for market transformation, would you say?
I think that there are really important roles. One is, you talked about just the amount of noise, and some of what we can do is sense making within that noise to be picking up what are the fundamental trends that in a way it almost doesn't matter what market sentiment is today. Yes, you've got to navigate that, but be paying attention to the really fundamental long-term shifts that are going to create not just reputational risk, but actually potentially existential risks. So some of that is sense making, awareness raising, building insight, not just insight into trends, but insight into what works, and building the capabilities to be able to respond. So I think there's a lot in that. That's a very big bucket that I just drew. I think there's a really important role beyond that, though, that is in catalysing and orchestrating. So if we talk about market-wide change, no single business can do this. We can't rely on a small group of heroic businesses to somehow take leadership and hope the rest will follow, or to somehow be sufficiently compelling and persuasive enough that they will tilt whole markets. It will require more beyond the usual suspects to engage. So I think building pre-competitive coalitions who've all got a vested interest in change, who can all say, look, this is just good for business, this is good for the economy, it's good for society, and if governments will act, we're ready to invest and innovate for the future. So I think some of that orchestration and that pre-competitive space. I think there's also a role in supporting some of the market making within value chains. In some sectors that absolutely need to transition, it's incredibly fragmented. And some of the work to actually bridge and create the acceleration infrastructure between the macro where we know it needs to change and there's high level analysis or policy, and the huge range of potential solutions that are kind of all around us, things that will help orchestrate and enable acceleration, that build those roadmaps to change, I think is another important role.
I really like that. And this idea of building bridges between the silos that we've got or the fragments we've got, and, perhaps creating unlikely partnerships with industries that have always kind of been rejected because they're bad. It's not really getting us anywhere, is it? So it's building those bridges and finding common goals to move forward. I totally agree with you. So going back to one of the reports that we mentioned, so Survival of the Fittest. So that argues that competitive sustainability is the new paradigm. So how are companies that embrace market transformation gaining a competitive advantage over those that don't in this space?
So I would flip that somewhat and say, look, most businesses work in markets, and markets are inherently competitive. And if we don't, and they don't have strategies that recognize that, then it's not really a strategy, it's doing something on the side. So if they're not clear about why what they're doing on sustainability is going to be good for the future resilience, competitive positioning, market share, future survival and thriving of the business, then it's not really strategic and unlikely to be effective. I would also say that a lot of the businesses that we and probably you've been working with know it's in their long-term interest to take action. They know they're vulnerable and are sitting with a whole basket of risks if they don't act, whether it's supply chain disruptions or shrinking markets or whatever it is. We can rehearse all of those. But if they take action now, in some places there are win-wins, and many of those are already banked. So many have got to the end of the win-wins in today's markets. If they take action now that's investing to build and position for the future, they'll be taking on short-term costs, and that sets them at a competitive disadvantage now. So it's how do they not sit with a competitive disadvantage relative to others that are saying, no, we're absolutely just going to prioritize short-term performance. So some of it is designing out that competitive disadvantage for those that are absolutely wanting to transition and position for the future, not just how do they gain short-term advantage now. So that's a frame on it. But businesses I would also say it's not a paradigm shift. Businesses compete. They know how to compete. I think the shift is how sustainability is situated in relation to that it isn't and can't. And I know that it's somewhat, in some places, shifted from being a source of momentum and differentiation to being seen as a compliance burden and it just being a box-ticking exercise. We just need to get it back out of that box to say, no, this is how you're going to thrive in a climate disrupted, resource constrained world. Does your strategy stack up in the face of plausible scenarios? And how are you going to avoid being outcompeted by those that are absolutely betting on the future? And what would have to be true for you to really be able to invest for the future rather than just defend the status quo in the past? So it's about bringing sustainability into how you run business rather than seeing it just as a compliance piece, which isn't where it always is, but I think too often it now does sit there.
I would agree. And I think the organisations that are doing well with the competitive advantage is where sustainability is front and centre of their strategy. Whether they call it sustainability or not is now another question, right? But versus it's a compliance issue or it's a marketing issue or whatever else it might be. Yeah. And so how are you seeing... So the way I see this as you're explaining this through is that yes, you're absolutely right. Businesses are used to competition. The bit that they're less used to is figuring out how to collaborate and still be competitive. So how are you seeing that evolving with the businesses you're working with?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think there are many more businesses, and I would say more parts of the community we're in, part of, I suppose, if a shorthand, the sustainable business community, that are recognising that this kind of business can save the world kind of narrative and rhetoric isn't like it's hit the end of the road in some way. Businesses need enabling markets. They need the confidence to be able to invest and innovate for the future. And I think there's growing recognition of that. All roads are leading to, look, we need those whose job it is to shape markets to be part of this, and that businesses inevitably need to work with government, and increasing recognition that we have all the solutions. It comes down to politics. Everything's political now. So by being neutral and staying in the background, we're not going to get the changes that we need to build that bridge to the future. So while I wouldn't say everybody's there, and I think there's a lot of fear given quite how polarised politics are, and nobody wants to put a target on their back, so we see a lot of green hushing. I think there's a lot of recognition that, you know what, we do need policy, and we are going to have really effective work between public and private sectors on effective regulation. So I'm seeing more recognition of that. But the question is, like, how do we get there? How do we achieve that? And a lot of our work is in that space. I'm very happy to share more about, I suppose, some of the lessons there, and somewhere in our recent report. But a recognition this isn't just about what are the right policy interventions, and clearly a lot of lessons learned and insight needed about if you're championing better regulation, what would that look like? Do we know which interventions actually are helpful and drive good outcomes versus create more bureaucracy? But also how to engage effectively with politics. It's not just the policy, it's the politics. If it hasn't got political support, it's not going to happen. So, and also perhaps back to your analogy around goalposts, recognising this is a competitive game and there's an opposition that is working to block progress. So this isn't just like a neutral field and everyone's, aiming for the same goal now. There's absolutely opposition that's blocking it. So being smart about the tactics, and they aren't necessarily playing by kind of good guy rules. So there's a lot more we can unpack, but it's recognising that this is political now.
It really is, isn't it? And I think the other thing is opportunities of businesses to come together to agree on a common set of rules that then can be presented as, we see these as the rules that we'll play by, and then they're pre-competitive rules in policy that can extend to competition on IP, for example, as well, I guess, for materials or things like that just allow size of offtake to be bigger, which also then means that they get a price parity, which then sets the level playing field. I guess those are some of the things. Yeah, it's really interesting at how some businesses are better at competing than others. I'd love to explore that more with you. So in that whole arena of, right, how we going to do market shifts, how do we get businesses to collaborate together while still being competitive and using sustainability as a kind of an advantage?
I think getting more businesses to recognise that this is in their strategic interest to do. It's not a nice to have. It's not part of being a good citizen. I suppose it's being targeted. It's only really relevant for any business that wants to be around, beyond the next year or two. If you simply want to cash out now, you have to care about being in business in the mid to long term to be able to have a compelling case. So I suppose it's targeting, which most big multinationals do, but being realistic that, there are a whole lot of things, of course, that businesses are having to grapple with, but this is about securing their future, so they have to care about their future. Getting more businesses to engage by landing the case for engagement in business terms, that this isn't about your reputation or rankings or compliance. Of course, those matter. It's about your future competitiveness and resilience and the survival of your sector. Will you even have markets in future? Will you have supply chains in future? Making it relevant to the issues they're grappling with, not just another thing on the to-do list, but as we know, many of the issues and many of the geopolitics are now as a result of competition for finite resources and so on. So landing that this is getting upstream of some of those issues, or you're constantly going to be dealing with downstream competition, downstream symptoms. I think then making it doable. I think there's a lot of fear, this is like boil the ocean. So being really focused and targeted about what's the intervention point, what's the audience, what needs to be true, how do we break this down into making it doable? And then a really important role in that strategic coalition building. This isn't about we're all going to hold hands and save the planet. This is being very targeted with some very clear objectives. It's not a thing that needs to run forever and another talking shop. It's being very focused on what's this trying to achieve, who are the allies, who needs to be in the room, who's got voice and influence and leverage and skin in the game, and who are the allies, and being clear-sighted on the opposition. So being very clear about the tactics. A whole lot of practical things about how do you support and how do you enable that and how do you stay the right side, of course, of competition law, because there have been a lot of threats and challenges to process around that, which are more in the mechanics of how to do it. But having those really trusted spaces that are very clear-sighted on the context are really important.
I think that's brilliant. And I think you're right. That is the shift, isn't it? It's the shift from this is an issue that we need to face, the greatest change of our time, etc. So creating the awareness and here's the hurdles that we need to overcome, and here's the solutions in this geography with this technology, with these players. That, I guess, that's a role that we could play really well, that would then help get the right people around the table and help investment flow, even from the unlikely players. Are you seeing actually, as we see these kind of geopolitics has upended the world, right? So have you seen any particular good examples of companies or indeed leaders that have managed to pivot well, and conversely those who've just said ignore the politics, we're doing this because it's the right thing, and are still doing well? Have you seen examples of either of those?
I see a lot of businesses that are saying, look, the US has taken a different course, and that has upended a lot of international kind of assumptions about the international direction we were on. And, that's a US first strategy. It's kind of no surprise, but it doesn't mean the rest of us have to be caught up in that and follow that agenda. But we have to be aware that that's a thing, and we're continuing with our strategy. But I have seen there's the green hushing. We're carrying on, but we're just not talking about it as much. And that's what I'm saying, and challenging that to say, okay, I can understand that you don't want to stick your head above the parapet and just be a target. But if we have collective green hushing, we're not rebuilding market sentiment. We're not building a sense of momentum. The market can't see what you're doing, and policymakers don't know what's possible, and regulators can't see that you've got solutions to some of the things they're grappling with. So be quiet is actually kind of handing a win to those that are opposing action. If everyone's just sitting quietly and doing all they can do, we're back to that incremental space. We can't change markets if everyone's sitting quietly. So I have seen a kind of a steadfast, resolute, we're not going to be bullied, we're carrying on, but we might be a bit quieter. So that's a dynamic that I've seen. what I do see is a lot of people, whether it's in boards or executive teams, who are increasingly concerned about the future, increasingly concerned about the direction of economies, the direction of societies, where there are a lot of angry people. It's really polarized, really fed up with all the fatalism and the declinism, know we need a new economic story and want to be part of building something better, but aren't necessarily clear on how best to do that, because this is uncharted territory in a way. This requires not just, here's the rules of the game, compete within them. It requires something new and different. And I'm encouraged by the fact that I think that appetite exists, but the challenge is, how do we unlock it, and how can that be orchestrated and unleashed in order that it can leverage the commercial acumen and strengths and entrepreneurial drive that sits within, whole sectors, but isn't yet being unleashed. So I see the appetite. I haven't yet seen it out there, but where I see the greatest, look, we're just going to carry on regardless and take this as a huge opportunity, of course, is China, who are absolutely seizing this opportunity to build competitiveness internationally and support multilateral engagement, because they recognize they'll need international markets and international allies, and that it's not in their national interest to have cascading climate crises. So that's where I've seen a more visible step up in this support for multilateralism, as well as absolute investment in innovation.
It's interesting how exactly that. So with China and maybe with economies that are focused on a plan rather than chaos and unpredictability from day to day, which makes it very, very difficult to come up with a new, more competitive economic situation that addresses society and the planet, right? But China has a plan, and so I agree with you. I think we're starting to see that emerge, whether it's in AI, whether it's in circular economy, it doesn't really matter. We're starting to really see this rise, also from Southeast Asia, which I think is fascinating. What's your biggest concern for the future of market transformation?
That it's just not going to happen fast enough to outpace cascading crises, that we're just the more and more of the symptoms of not having got upstream and tackled just means that it just dominates, like the short-term crisis response means there won't be a fast enough engagement to design out the challenge in the first place. Theoretically, it's doable, but if everyone's paralyzed by having to respond to crisis after crisis, it's going to be really hard to get upstream. So it's a concern of timing, not whether it's possible or whether it could work or whether the solutions exist. That's where my concern is, that it's always being knocked, like people will agree, but it's not the today priority. So it's not those fighting progress. Absolutely see that progress would be an existential risk and are fighting really hard. Those, on the other hand, the majority that stand to lose through lack of progress, are not fighting equally hard to drive progress because they don't see it. They've just got a whole lot of other crises to deal with short term. So that's my concern, that it's just not being approached with the same, this is a fight for our future. Yeah.
I would agree with that. And do you think it's something maybe to do with language that we've used? We've dehumanized sustainability by making it about the planet rather than making it about society or people. And I wonder if there's something in finding language that's neutral, that's apolitical. So nobody wants themselves, their children, their grandchildren to grow up in waste, for example, pollution. That's kind of it's a point we can't really argue against. And I wonder if finding that helps us to build some commonality. I don't know what you think to that.
Yeah. It's a good question. And I think there are, I suppose, two places where we haven't landed. We've talked about, used jargon and talked about, whether it's net zero or we've talked about saving the planet. The planet is going to be here well beyond any of us. That's not and although, it's a save us. It's the climate impacts on us. It's what having a degraded environment will mean for people and for the future. And many people do care very deeply about nature in and of itself. So we haven't tapped into the people piece. And so it's kind of, oh my goodness, we've got this so wrong, those of us in this space, that there's a populist argument against action when the people who are most affected by inaction are those who are feeling most kind of ignored, excluded, left behind, and are losing from the structure that we've got. And they haven't been part of the conversation. I think who's been having the conversation, it's quite elitist, it's quite jargony, it's quite technocratic, it's quite top down, it doesn't give a space for citizens. It's like, trust us, we'll sort it out, and we haven't sorted it out. So I think there's a big piece there. I do see, surprisingly, I'm almost always assuming that when I go and talk to executive teams, they'll be quite cynical, but actually it's very clear. I'm often surprised at how deeply people care, how deeply concerned they are about society and want to be part of making it better, but know they need to do that through the business in ways that are also good for the business. So I think not enough tapping into that and too much technocratic, bureaucratic framing. Of course, we need data and standards and reporting, but that's dominated and it just is not motivating. On the other hand, I don't think we've talked enough about what it is that markets care about. We've kind of assumed markets would care about the fact that you've got a nice purpose statement and great values, but they don't care any about values. So we haven't also framed the business action in language markets care about. So we haven't appealed to the human and we haven't appealed to markets, and we've landed somewhere in the middle. So yeah, that sounds like a bit of a beat up, and we've failed, but we've learned a lot.
Yeah, but I think it is really interesting, and I really like your points about it being elitist. I think it is elitist. I also think it's very global north dialogue focused, and there's so many solutions in the global south that we alluded to. I think that needs to come to the table. But it's almost this, as you say, how do we bring forward the future to now to get this sense of urgency? It's almost like saying, we know type 2 diabetes is really, really bad, but I'm still going to eat my sweets and cake today because I really want them. And so it's like, how do we bring those two things together to start on the progress and feel rewarded for it?
Yeah. And I think, so many different strands here. And some of that is, there are parts where we've had, I suppose, real social momentum and traction, the sense that, look, if everybody's doing it, if everybody's stepping up and taking action, then yes, we want to be part of that. But when people see, like, other people aren't, then they say, well, I'm being naive. And so a lot, even though we see and know how much China is investing, one of the most common things I hear is, why should we if China isn't? So, but, it can bust that particular myth, but that sense that, well, why would we if others aren't, even if that particular myth isn't right? But there's that sense of, and then that, you told me that, if and I suppose this is more in your space, that if I sort all my recycling out, it will help. And then if they found out actually what happens after it's taken away means, is not, although like, what is the point of me doing what I think is a responsible thing, or, sacrificing time or whatever, if actually it's not making a difference? So I think a lot of those, rebuilding trust and rebuilding a sense we're all in it together, because why would anyone, be self-sacrificing, pay more and so on? So how do we recapture and rebuild trust, public imagination, engagement in it, rather than just say, no, trust us this time. We're serious this time.
Yeah, yes. And maybe also showcasing data points of success stories, however small they are, to prove that it is better, both short and long term. And I don't think we do enough of that as a society. So maybe the last question I've got for you is, we've talked about maybe some of the challenges and we've talked about some of the solutions. What gives you greatest hope? What's the glimmer of hope?
It's back to the point I was making earlier, that I can see quite how many senior, influential, really thoughtful people there are in a whole range of organisations that are in positions of influence, who are deeply concerned about the future and who actively want to be part of doing something better. The fact that they haven't necessarily quite worked out what that is or how they'll do it, but it exists. So I think we've got this kind of missing middle. People in the past who might have been more active and engaged, I think they're there and they're smart and they can see the challenges around them. So I see that as huge opportunity, because that potential exists. So this isn't just wait for the young people and assume somehow miraculously that will save us. I do think that there are a whole range of people who just deeply frustrated in a whole range of fronts and want to be part of something. So the fact that that exists gives me hope.
That's fabulous, and a great way to end this conversation. It's really lovely to meet you. It's really, really good to meet you, but I hope we'll get to spend some time together in the not too distant future. It'd be very good.
That would be great. Thank you.
Thank you.